Okay, welcome to Myodynamics Level 2, Week 7. You guys on the live session, you know how it's done. I already checked with you, but you had no questions about last week. But if you do, or anything comes up this week, just place them there. I want to make sure that it's really understood last week's class, because we're gonna start from that point and continue, okay, this week. So I don't know if you guys have seen this film, The Last Airbender. But it does have an interesting, aside from the story or anything, it does have an interesting set of effects in here. One in particular that is we're talking about today, which is what they call the fire bending. Okay, fire bending. You can see, I was trying to find the video that only shows that bit, but you can kind of see throughout the trailer. There is something here too, I believe.
Upon a chosen few.
Okay, this kind of stuff. Even with the water would work. In this case, of course, is fire, what is more. See if I can find another example. Or if you guys know, if you guys in the live session, if you know another site that has a better example of the fire bending on its own, by all means. This is just the trailer of the film. But I believe there's quite a few samples in here. There we go. So there should be some. But basically, they have this ability of taking fire. And pulling it from the source, manipulating it, and then throwing it at something, right? So this fire will behave very dynamic, okay, very real, but obviously this kind of stuff, okay, having the ability of launching fire at someone in that way is very surreal. So that's what we're going to try to do today. Here's another example. I thought I saw a clip here. There we go. Okay, so this trail of fire being thrown at someone, for example, okay? So like I said, it will use the dynamics from last week where things were moving in a very realistic way. Okay, there was nothing magical, fantastic about it. We're going to take that fire, we're going to manipulate it and have it do other things, okay? Whatever we want, actually. We can throw it at something, have it spin around, okay? As I go through the class, you will probably get a lot of ideas what you can do with it. So firebending is I wish I had a better example. There was a video that I found a while back. They keep showing me these cartoons. And it seems like there's a lot of people testing on their own, like with After Effects and things like that. But there used to be a video from ILM. ILM did that effect, so I don't seem to be able to find it. So if you guys, throughout the class, if you find a better example, please just share it in the chat window and I will click it here so everybody can see it. It's pretty crap what I can find here. Alright, so anyway. Am I sharing my screen? Sorry, I have always, yeah, perfect. So I'm sharing my screen. Beautiful. Alright, so I did a little clip myself, which I'll post in the community for reference as usual. Okay, so we get this. I'm not doing anything, I'm obviously throwing the fire at something, right? It's trails of fire. But I could very easily, instead of doing straight lines like I did with some turbulence, I could have done tornadoes, or I could have done like they do, like they grab it with their hands and they kind of spin their hands around and the fire gets, into like a sphere and then launch it at something. Anyway, anything I want, I can do with this method. What's happening here, I'm launching these trails in almost like a straight line. I'm moving my camera around them just so you can see them from both angles. That's all. So I'm going to keep this handy today. But if you compare this fire with what we did last week, which is right here. Okay, so that's my fire from last week. If I move them around, you can see that is clearly the same element, okay? Same tone, same colors. It is the same thing. So I'm basically taking this fire and modifying it to do this, what I have here. So I'm gonna keep both videos around and let's see how we do something like that. So what I have here is my container from last week. Okay, you can see my full resolution container, meaning the one that I did render, the one that I showed you on this clip. Okay, and this one has you can see a lot of resolution. It's a 5-to-1. It's not exactly what we were doing last week. The dimensions from last week were a little bit different, but it's basically I just basically change the dimensions of my container. That's all. So I'm going to be using this one. And at this resolution of 500, as you can see, 5-to-1 is what gives me then this look. And I could have easily go higher than that. So you can see that my amount of voxels is not that much. Okay, you remember to always keep an eye on that. So basically, in this example, I have 500. Sorry. Times 125. Okay, times 100. So 6.2 million voxels. That is very low res. Okay, so I could have gone a lot higher and get a lot more detail out of it, but it does the trick quite nicely. All right, so the way this works, okay, the way you do this is basically using particles as your source of emission. And the reason I wait this long to do this, okay, on this course, I've seen that some people in the community have started to try it. That's fine. The reason I wait this long is because by now you should be, if you're following these courses in order, you should be with me for about 19 hours of training or 18 hours of training and such. Meaning that you should be able to move particles very comfortably. You should be able to do whatever you wanted as far as motion for particles goes. So whatever I'm going to tell you right now is going to become very easy. So we don't have to focus too much on that part, okay, of particle motion. But what I will use in this case is actually end particles, not regular particles. It could be done with regular particles, but end particles have an attractive thing that we can use in this case. So it's either way will work fine. Okay. Well, I'm going to disable the fluid so we can concentrate on the particles first. So let's just turn the display off and disable this. Remember, so my scene now will move. You can see my camera animation. Okay, that's the animation that is you can see on the video, on the clip. Basically, I'm just doing that. And I'm going to double check if this, okay, this is not cached. That's good. All right, cool. So I'm going to create a camera just to work around. All right, perfect. So let's talk a little bit about end particles. We use them for the class with the big wall of fluid for the Prometheus section. We use the thick cloud. And I talked a little bit about some of the attributes, but we really didn't go deeper into most of them. So end particles, I give this analogy to all my students all the time. End particles is, imagine that you have a little Toyota, a Corolla, very old car, very cheap, cheap to run, okay, cheap to fix, and it takes you every day from home to work. It does the trick, it's beautiful, done. But it lacks all these fancy things that you could have in a fancier car, a more expensive car. And then you buy yourself a big pimped out Mercedes, you know, and you use it for exactly the same thing. You're going to use it to go from point A to point B, home to work. It's a lot more expensive to run, but it has all these buttons and dials and does all these things for you. That is end particles. End particles is the Mercedes of the particles world, okay? You wouldn't use that big pimped out Mercedes to just go get the groceries in the corner, right? You probably go in the cheap car to do that. So it's a similar scenario, okay? So end particles are great. They have a lot of controls and a lot of, probably some cases I think is too much attributes to mix around and RAMs, and you'll see now. But they're very expensive, so it comes with a price. So you have to use them lightly. You have to make sure when is a good opportunity to use them. Particles will do pretty much the same. So far we've been using particles up to this stage, and there's a lot of steps that you need to take in order to kill particles, to change their radius, change their color. It takes a few clicks to do those such things. With end particles might be a lot faster to get to that point, but like I said, they tend to evaluate a bit slower, okay? So careful with it. So end particles, we're going to be now on the end dynamics. And I believe I mentioned it, but the whole N thing stands for nucleus, okay? It's a nucleus solver. It's a unified solver that will deal, nowadays in the new Maya, deal with the hair system, with the N hair system, N cloth, N particles, and you can mix in there fluids as well. So everything within that realm can interact with one another, which is pretty cool to deal with. So on the n particle system, okay, you have to determine what kind of particles you want to create. So if you go to create n particles, then you can see you have the emitter section, which is right here, and you also have a type of particle that you're making. And this preset, you should think of them as presets. Okay, what's happening down here? All it's doing is the same exact particle system. It's not like there's different kind of n particles. It's just basically turning things on and off, and setting certain values for you, giving you an initial, almost like not initial state, but a preset, okay, a starting point that has attributes and things that will kind of resemble this kind of look. With the difference, of course, the one we use with the thick cloud, that one also creates a fluid container and makes us a texture, as you saw a few weeks back. So there's not much point on explaining all of them one by one. I'm going to stick to this one, okay, balls, which is the one that is the most common, probably. And you can think of them almost as they're getting more and more expensive to deal with as we go down this list. That's the perfect arrangement. Points are n particles as well, but they have most things disabled. Interparticle collisions and things like that, they're turned off. So they almost behave like particles, regular matter particles. Then you get to this kind, which is pretty good. And the cloud and thick cloud deal with more volumetric things, as you saw. And then the water one, don't think that this is going to be real flow or NIOD. This call it water, but it's not really there. It does something. It does call water because it uses an SPH solver. Okay, same kind of solver that real flow will use for the regular emitters. So it has things like incompressibility and viscosity. Okay, it's aware of those things, but it's not really robust enough to do water simulations. You could do basic stuff, but you could do honey. The more viscous the liquid, probably the better the chance you will get to do something good with n particles in that matter. So first you have to select the type. Once you do that, then you have to select the type of emission you want to do. You've seen this before. That's why I don't really mind bothering with putting this n particles first on the course, because you know this by heart. So the only difference will be the fill object, and it's just what the name tells you. You pick a piece of geometry, you hit that, and it will just fill it with particles, which is great. I'm going to make a regular emitter. Okay, just a little box. And for now, I'm going to hide my fluid, so it almost feels like it's an empty scene. And I'm going to show you the grid. And I'm going to move my particles up. And once you make n particles, by now you must know probably that it makes the emitter, the particle system, and it makes a nucleosolver node right here. Okay, so the nucleosolver will deal with all the calculations, and actually it's responsible for moving these particles around. So under nucleus, I'm going to start with this one actually. You have built in already a gravity field and an air field, which you can see them right here. You know what the gravity does. No need to explain that. An air field is honestly just that, is an air field. Like if you were to go to fields air or field uniform, probably is closer to what this does. But you can see you have an air density, the speed of the wind, which is basically your magnitude, a direction, and a noise value on that. Simple as that. We're going to touch this next week or the week after when we start doing playing with nCloth a little bit more. Okay, so but that's all there is. You have, those of you, I think some of, if not all of you, most of you in this course are taking also my level 3 in PullDownIt, and you know the PullDownIt has an option there called the use Maya grid as your ground plane, right? Basically makes an infinite ground plane to collide with. We suggested that, actually I suggested that personally to the PullDownIt guys to add that on the PullDownIt, because what the n particle system does, okay, is a much better way to collide, and you always need a ground plane. I mean, most cases you need a ground plane. So what this does, if you turn this on, is basically creates an infinite plane that my particles will be able to collide with from scratch. I'm going to rewind, hit play, and you get that. Okay, so these particles will never, ever, ever. This is much cheaper. It's super precise. You would never have a particle going below that point. And what is that point? In PullDownIt, that's what's missing. That you cannot really change the height. of your collision. And it's actually, we kind of spotted a bug on the previous version where it was offset by a unit. I think, Dave, you were the one who was saying, on mic, you saw that. This one you can say the plane origin, you can move it up and down in Y, for example, to 2 units. Okay, so if you do this, it's going to be funky, but there you go. It pushes my particles up, and then now they're colliding. If you look through the side view, for example, perfectly at 2 units. So try to use this option. Oops, sorry. Camera 1. Okay, so try to use this option as much as you can for collisions. Now, what you can see here also is the end particles are able to collide, obviously, with geometry. Excuse me 1 second. My foot went numb. Oh my god. Okay. Sorry about that. They can collide with geometry. They can collide with this infinite ground plane, but if you keep an eye close, okay, they will also be able to collide with themselves. So that is a big advantage compared to regular particles. Regular particles have no awareness of each other. You can fake interparticle collisions on regular particles, but these guys are the real deal. We saw on the class with the Prometheus thing that these particles are also able to collide because we actually, rotate. And the rotations are based on collision. So we played with that last week. So those are the main attractive things. There's a million attributes. We'll go over some of them, but that is to me the most attractive thing. Okay, so back on the nucleus, you can see then you have, sorry, click on the wrong thing. You have then your ground plane with friction and bounciness and stickiness like any surface, right? And then you get your solver attributes, substeps. Okay, those of you taking my real flow course, you will find this related. Okay, substeps for evaluation. So you could increase your substeps. Okay, same thing happens in pull down it. Okay, the more substeps, the more precise your simulation is, and of course is slower to move through. You get the collision iterations and collision ranges. That's just for precision of collisions, the iterations. Okay, the more iterations is how many times you're going to check for collisions on any given substep. In the layer ranges, I don't know, collision layers, we haven't talked about it. Probably we'll do that better on the enclosed section, but you could specify different collision layers so things don't collide with other. For example, these particles can collide with geometry, with certain pieces of geometry. I'll explain it better next week, probably, when we do enclosed. So there you go. So the nucleus deals with that, deals with the precision of the calculation. It has built in a couple of fields, an infinite ground plane for collision, and it also deals with the time and the scale of the simulation. Okay, so time attribute, that here's where you specify where the simulation begins. It's not going to be on the particles themselves like it's on regular particles. And the scale of the entire scene. And you can see that it's a time scale and a space scale. So things are like time warp and all that you could do by modifying the time scale, for example. So that is nucleus. In the nucleus solver, it gets shared. Okay, the idea is to share it between multiple items. So let's say you have n club and n particles in the same scene, and if your intention is to have them interact with each other, then they will be sharing the nucleus solver. Again, I think next week we'll probably take a look at that part. Now, on the particles themselves, right? You have, like I said, a gazillion attributes to go through, and most of them are driven by numbers directly. Okay, an attribute that you can plug in a number, or you can drive them with ramps like the ones that we use on fluids. So I'm not going to go over every single one because it takes too long. Things to care for are the collision section. Okay, the first thing you can see is that you have a tab for collide and self-collide. Okay, so like I said, these particles collide with geometry and with themselves. If you don't need one of those two or either one of those, then turn them off, because it takes a bit of memory or time to go through it. So if you, in my case, for example, if I'm not expecting to have any piece of geometry in here to collide with, then I can easily turn off collisions, right? That being said, let's add a piece of geometry. So let's say a cube. Scale this guy. Cool. A neat thing is you can see here, it shows you the collision plane, the infinite collision plane. Is you can grab it in here, and I don't think you can move it, but at least it shows you where it is. I'm gonna put that back to 0. Okay, and I'm gonna move this box. Sorry, that's not what I wanted to move. I'm gonna move the box a little bit to the side. So by default, okay, even though you saw that my particles, if I grab them back, I'm gonna get rid of the grid. If I grab my particles, you can see the collision is turned on and there's geometry in the scene. You will think that automatically it will collide, but no. You have to basically include into your nucleus simulation the geometry that you want to use. So in this case, this box will have to be added. And the way you add that is by going into the NMesh, anything related with geometry. NMesh is what you're going to be using also for the NCLOV part, which is not for today. But if you go to NMesh, you can basically create a passive collider, and this box will be, those of you taking the level 3 will pull down it, is if you had a static object. Those of you familiar with rigid bodies in Maya is a passive rigid body. Okay, same thing here. Okay, so a passive collider. Now this guy is connected to the nucleus solver, is aware of the situation here, and these particles now are able to collide with it, as you can see. Okay, these collisions are very precise. It's quite stable. Okay, I'm not trying to say no, don't use end particles, but don't overuse them. That's all. They're very precise and very nice. Just a little bit more complicated to calculate for something simple. You know. Plus, you know, I think your brain stays sharper if you have to do some of those things by hand. You will see. So there you go. Collisions are activated. They're done. Of course, you can see if you grab the particles, turn off the collide section, it will move a little bit faster, but these guys are just going to start going through the box, as you would expect. Cool. So this is important. Now, these particles have, okay, you have to keep in mind something, okay? These particles have on the collision model, okay, what we call the collision model, they use a proxy, okay, an approximation of their shape. Right now they're all spheres, is easy, no problem, but they used a shape that is separate from their regular topology, okay? So basically for collisions, so I can grab these particles and then display, for example here, display my collision thickness, what it's called, and it's basically showing you these yellow spheres. What this means is that these particles have a separate model, okay, a separate shape that is used on collisions. And this shape can be bigger or smaller than the particle. If you need it, okay, you could increase what is called the collide width scale. Okay, if I make this number 2, you can see that the yellow representation of these particles, which is just the collision model, gets twice as big. If I go back to off, you can see these particles are the same size. This is a possibility. I mean, you could do this if you wanted, and as it exists for collision thickness, it also does for self-collision. Okay. So self-collision thickness is set to 1. I could just, for example, do 0.1. Well, that's a bit too small, but you can get the idea. And it looks like, okay, these things are multiplied together. So yes, there will be, you could have a different self-collision size scale, sorry, from the collision scale, but be aware, as you saw, that these two are related. Okay. So that is something to keep in mind, and then you know what bounce and friction will do. You know what stickiness does. Okay, it's just how sticky, or how much this particle will adhere to that surface. Nothing there to go over. And this number, the max self-collision iterations. Okay, the higher you go, the more precise. But be careful because it gets extremely slow very quickly. So that is honestly, that is the main area, but you can see you control the particle size, so you don't need to go in to these particles and do a radius pp if you don't want to. It's already made for you. You can control it on a per object basis. If you remember from level 1, when we're talking about per object and per particle attributes, this is per object, all of them at the same time, or you can randomize them individually here. Okay, so all done for you automatically, and the collision model, because it's based on the radius of each particle, will obviously adapt to that. Okay, that number, the collision, the collide width and self-collide width is obviously based, this number is based on the size of the particle. And you can see that you can, like many attributes, when we go down this list, you will see that most of them can be modified also on with ramps based on attributes that you can have here, either custom made by you, or some of the default ones that you can see based in the radius on your speed, acceleration, particle ID, okay, normalized age. So a lot of those things you will have to go on regular particles and put an expression. Is this put for you? It's not magically there. There is an expression already made. That's all I'm saying. It's just skipping some of those steps for you. So nothing there. You know what the radius will do. Other things that I think is important to talk about is the ability that these particles have to attract themselves and repel themselves. I think that is interesting as well. It doesn't mean that we cannot do it with regular particles. It's easily done, but it's here built in for you. So if you scroll down a few of these things, I'm going to come back up in a minute, but the force field generation, okay, is the part that we're going to use in this example today. You can see that you have, well, first of all, you have to specify if it's based on the scale of the scene or if it's based on the scale of your object, of your particle itself. What do I mean by the scale of it? Is because you have these attributes here, these distances, okay, magnitudes, that the solver needs to know if you're going to be basing these values, for example, of distance on a scene scale, or is just basically on the scale of your particles. And what this does, I usually tend to use thickness relative, but experiment with both, doesn't matter. What this will do is it will allow these particles to attract themselves or repel themselves. So we do that on regular particles by putting a radial field on a per particle basis, okay, and controlling it that way. Here is already built in. So the self-attract value can be positive or negative, and it will indicate if they will attract themselves or repel themselves. We're going to use it in an example today. This is a very important one. And they need to know what is the distance where they're going to be looking for neighbors to either pull or push, okay? So that's what the point field distance will do. So you have a magnitude of the overall thing, okay? You have to set this number to positive or negative to attract or repel, and then give them a distance to look for all the particles. And you can control things with ramps as well, okay? So that's fine. By what we did on the previous class, that these particles are able to calculate rotations. In this case, I don't need them for the example of today, but if you need a refresher, go back a few weeks and find that class, because I did talk about that one. Basically, you turn it on, and the rotation is calculated based on collisions. So if particles start to collide with themselves, then the rotation gets passed on, and there is an attribute called rotation PP. That's the one to query. These particles are able to generate wind, to generate some wind force, and there's wind shadowing and all that kind of fancy stuff. I don't know. I don't use this too much. Not because I'm not saying that it doesn't work. I just don't. I don't know. Sometimes I don't find the. Probably I'll show you an example where we do cloth. With cloth, it's probably better to look at it, because these particles, for example, can be flying next to a piece of cloth, and generate a wind force that will move the cloth and deform it. So, definitely useful. Of course, it's useful. It's just one of those things. I don't know. Not that popular at least on my scene files. But you have a push distance and the vorticity of it. If these particles are going to self-shadow the wind that they're generating. I don't know, a lot of stuff in here. Liquid simulation, I will use this one on my real flow course. So I haven't used it yet, but I will. So I will leave that for that course. You can watch the recording. It will be towards the end, toward week 9 or 10 or something. But you can kind of take a look at what's going on in here. Ramps everywhere, which is crazy. It's good, but there's lots of stuff. The shading part, you will find a lot of relation to fluids, because you have the similar kind of layout. Okay, you got an opacity control with a ramp. You got a color. Okay, you can drive it on many attributes, and you even have incandescence, which is cool. So very similar to fluids in here. You can add any per particle attribute you like, just like you use particles. You see what I mean? Like the radius, opacity, and color already have built-in expressions and ramps. And if you go in there, if you go, well, not here. If you go to the expression, sometimes, no, there's nothing in here. Sometimes I thought you could see the expressions already revealed, but there's a lot of stuff going in behind the scenes. You can instance instance geometry into these particles, and I used this on my level 3, and I already used it on. If you look at one of those recordings from like 3 weeks ago, you will see I'm instancing geometry on end particles. Okay, they respond to goals. Okay, they're right on their essence. Okay, the Toyota and the Mercedes. Okay, there's a car. It is a particle, so they respond to the same rules. Fields will affect them, just like it. Okay? I skimmed through a lot of stuff. If you guys in the live session you want to talk about something specific regarding M particles, we can obviously put more time in there. I personally don't think is too much more to talk about. On the dynamic properties, for example, you can see that you have a damp and a drag field, and that's all there are. There's a drag field built in. That's all. The damping, you have a conserve attribute, the conserve momentum that any particle has, but it also has a damp attribute as well. Sometimes they're a bit redundant, in my opinion, but you can just basically have an ability of this particle lose energy by either one of those methods. Okay, the drag field is cool. It's not only built in, but it's already using a value of 0.01, which I think is a very cool. That's the way it should be. And you can ignore, okay, by default the gravity and the wind are being used, but you could obviously turn them off by using this. It is better to do it this way than to go into the nucleus solver and turning them off there, because you probably, like I said, you share the nucleus with multiple items. So if you have cloth and particles and hair, you might not want the gravity on the particles, but you might want to keep it the same on the cloth and the hair. So it's best to you do it on an individual, on each item on its own. Okay. So now I'm going to jump to the example. Before I do, let me just take a look at my guys here. Is everything making sense? Am I going too fast, or what do you guys think? Any observations? Any questions? Don't speak all at once. You know, it's overwhelming, the responses. Come on, guys. There we go. Yeah, that's what I want to hear. All right, cool. I didn't hear from the rest of you, but I hope that you guys are fine. If not, you know, just type it there. I'll keep checking. All right, cool. So now we got that, you know, out of the way, I can go in and actually do what I wanted to do today, which is that example. So this box is no longer necessary. I'm going to reveal again. I'm going to show my fluid. Here it is. And I'm going to take the emitter that I already have. I'm going to place it on one end, and I'm going to scale this guy a little. And particle emitters are just regular particle emitters. There's nothing there different. So there's no need to talk about them. I'm going to put this emitter somewhere there. And I'm going to take advantage, I don't know, I'm going to take advantage of the built-in gravity, for example, just because I can. I don't know. And the fact that it's called gravity doesn't mean that it has to push particles down. It's just a force field, right? So I'm going to go in and change the direction. Instead of pushing those guys down, okay, on the negative y, I'm just going to push these particles on the positive z, the one that is pointing, okay, the direction that I want. That way I don't have to create an extra force field. You know me, I'm trying to always keep my scene files to the minimum number of fields and particle systems and all. Try to be economical. That means you can work a little faster. All right, so let's see. What I want to do is basically push these particles. Let me rewind and play this back. Okay. Push these particles away. I was thinking, why is it emitting only on half? It's because if I look at my grid, these particles are still colliding with the floor. So let's go in and optimize this scene a little. First of all, I don't care for collisions with geometry. At least not. If you were to go, I closed it as usual, but if you were to go, can you guys do me a favor on the live session? If you have a minute while I'm doing the class, can you Google and find an example for that fire bending thing? I know there is a cool video that I found somewhere, like a breakdown from ILM, that it has some very interesting, but if you find something that you think is useful, can you paste it to the chat window and I will open it and look. That way you don't have to see me go through YouTube and Google. You know? If you guys can give me a hand with that, that'll be great. In the meantime, while you do that, I'm gonna I was saying that I don't really need collisions on this example, but on the stuff from the Airbender, for example, you do have to collide with geometry, and also you will probably keep the collide activated. In my case, I'm going to turn it off. That will take care of this separation thing of these particles with the ground plane. Let me just stop this for a minute. So the collisions are off. I'm going to turn off self-collide for now, although I'm going to keep it. I'm going to see why this emitter is doing this, which is a bit retarded. It's like still taking the ground, okay. Good call. You see, I'm glad that this happened to me. I turned off collisions, and I turned off self-collisions. But yet, if I move this emitter down, I still see the collision with the ground plane. Right? You can see it there. That's what this is happening. Okay, these particles are colliding with the ground. That is because it's independent, all three of them. So I will have to go in here and turn off use plane, and that will disable this option. So now I get my particles flowing as I want it. So keep that in mind. So your collisions could be off, meaning that it won't collide with geometry, but this ground plane is on an independent, separate thing. So I'm going to turn on self-collide. And collisions in my case are going to be off. But again, if you need an obstacle, keep them on. I'm going to reduce my particle count. Let's do a few the usual things. I'm going to go in and take on my emitter. Lower my rate. And you can see I already got my particles flowing. And I'm going to give these guys a lifespan. Start killing them after a few frames, because I basically don't care for them. Okay? The way this is going to go now is that I'm going to turn those particles into fluid emitters. The reason I'm reusing the fire from last week is because that way I don't have to go in and redo all the work on the fire. So my advice to you is get comfortable generating fire. Get a real hang of it. Once you do, then start reusing those containers. Okay, keep them around. If you do just one fire and then you start reusing them for the rest of your career, then God forbid something happens and you lose that file, you have to do it from scratch, and you will spend more time than you should. That's what I'm saying. Practice enough, get comfortable with it, and then start saving those things and reuse them. That way I can skip all the shading section, all the dynamics bar, all the stuff that we did last week, and just jump all over that. So I don't care about the fluid, the container this time. I'm going to turn those particles into fluid emitters, and they're going to be pumping out this fire that we just did. So I need to basically, I don't care for when the particles are outside this container, I don't need them anymore. So that's why I'm going to kill them right when they leave this box. And I'm going to eyeball it because it's faster. So I'm going to make them all a constant lifespan, let's say 4 seconds. And let's see how that goes. How fast they move from right to left, that is the gravity's field influence, so you can change that. Let's try 7. See how that goes. That's too much. You round it up. Let's see if 6 will do. That's about right. So 6 seconds, I get my lifespan done. A few things to keep in mind. I'm going to turn them into fluid emitters right away. So I'm going to grab these particles. I'm going to shift select my container. Then on the dynamics menu, you go to fluids, fluid effects, sorry. Additive content, emit from object. And the only thing you need to make sure you turn on is the emitter type to omni. No surface, no curve, omni. Okay. That means that each particle becomes its own emitter. Leave everything at default. We'll just change those things later. Hit apply and close. Now these guys are able to emit fluid. I'm going to reactivate my container, but I'm going to lower my resolution to be able to work fast. And I'm going to turn on the display. And I'm also going to save this thing because I haven't saved this in a long time. So I already made this scene for you. So save it. And let's hit play and see what's going on in here. So we'll see if it becomes too slow. I will have to lower my resolution a bit more. All right, but of course, nothing seems to be happening. Okay, first make sure your particles are inside the box, and they are. This grid is annoying, so I'm going to hide it. But also my emitter, when I turn them into emitters, you can see that the fluid emitter is now below the particles. I'm not emitting anything, so that's why. So let's go in. You could grab numbers from your emitter, fire emitter that you used on the example of last week and try to mimic those. But keep in mind that each particle is an emitter now, so you will have to adjust things a little. I don't remember which numbers to use, but I'm going to guess it here. So I'm going to do... So you'll find the numbers yourself. We'll see. I think if I recall, these are the numbers that I should be using. I don't want to spend time on that because we already went through this. Now, if you remember from the first couple of lessons, I was talking about if the emitter is traveling through the container, turn on motion streak. And these guys definitely are flying through. So motion streak is important in this case. And I also want to pass the velocity of the particles into the fluid. If you don't do that, basically the fire is going to be born, but it's not going to move a little bit forward like it should. So, or there won't be any relation, any connection between the motion of these particles and the fire simulation. So the fire will continue to move up as it did last week, but there's no forward motion, which doesn't make much sense. So basically what you want to do is add the velocity and inherit the velocity from the emitter itself. We used it lightly, and it was kind of hard to see the effect on the Prometheus landing. Right? We wanted to pass on the rotation of the engine to the fluid, and it was very subtle. Here you will definitely see it, and I'm going to use 120% of the velocity inheritance from the particle to the fluid. Aside of that, well, no. This is what we've done regularly. Up to this point, we have used all these attributes ourselves. There's a turbulence value here that we should probably use. But we haven't used this tab here, the basic emitter attributes section. If you open it up, this is very useful once you start using particles as emitters. Especially these two. Well, actually, these two attributes are very important. The use per point emission rate, or what is called the rate PP. If you remember from level 1, we use that a lot. And also using the radius of the particle, and involving that radius into the simulation. Those two are very important. And it's something that I should mention that you should keep in mind, and is the relationship now between, up to this point I was very vocal about the relationship between the size of the container and the amount of voxels. And by now it's perfect. You guys you're speaking in terms of ratios, which is beautiful. And I think that's a good way. Now, another thing you should keep in mind when you start using particles now is the ratio between the size of the particle and the size of the voxel. That is also important. Because let's say you have a voxel with the size of 1, and you have a particle that also has a radius of 1. When that particle enters that voxel, occupies fully, the voxel, meaning that it's going to fill it up with density right away. That's going to be, the ratio is 1 to 1, and that ratio, as opposed to with the fluids, with the size and the voxel count, the ratio is when it's lower. When it's, well, I better continue my example before I swallow my own tongue here. 1 to 1 ratio is going to just fill the voxel right away. Let's say that you take your simulation, you work on that ratio, and everything is fine, you're happy. And then you go in and you upres your container. And you upres it to, for example, 3 to 1 or 4 to 1. Let's say 4 to 1. That means a voxel that used to be 1 unit in size now is 0.25 units in size. And your particle didn't change. The particle remained at 1. So now this particle is 4 times bigger than the voxel. What does it mean? That it's going to take 4 voxels around, it's going to fill them up with density. So in that case, the change might not be so noticeable. It could be all right. But what happens is the opposite. Let's say that you lower your resolution. So instead of a voxel having a size of 1, now a voxel has a size of 4. And the particle stays at 1. Now the ratio is 4 to 1, but this particle is 4 times smaller than the voxel. So the amount of density that is going to be pumped in to that voxel is going to be 4 times less. So keep that in mind, because changing your resolution and not changing the size of the particle, it will translate into the amount of density or heat or fuel, okay? It's going to vary based on that. So be very aware of it. If you moving your resolution up, if you're down, reducing the resolution of the container, make sure that you adjust the particle size accordingly. Otherwise, you will have a simulation that works. You change your resolution, and then somehow they have no more density being emitted. It's just because of that. Okay, it's the ratio of the particle size versus the voxel size. I'm gonna just take a peek. Someone found the video. Beautiful. I'm gonna open it in a minute, just so I can speed up here. Perfect. So let's go in now and rewind and play and see what this is doing. And you can see now the density, well, in general, things are starting to being emitted here. And you can see what I was saying right now. If you go frame by frame, you will see that, hopefully, you see. Okay, I went too far, damn it. But I was trying to show you that you see density in this container before the particle even enters. Let's see if I can do it. Yeah, beautiful, dead on. Right, look at this thing. See if I can look at it through the side view. Yeah, this is what I'm talking about. So you can see this particle, the particle size, but I'm not introducing the radius. I'm not using the radius of the particle in the simulation. This means that all these particles have a size, a radius of 1 unit. Okay, so check out my particle here. This particle has a radius by default of 1 unit. 1 unit is this box. Okay, so from this point forward, 1 unit is the size, is the consideration of this, the size of this particle. So that's where you start getting density before the particle enters the container. If I upres, or if I reduce the size of this, once I start introducing a radius per particle, then this will change. Then it will be more precise. So go into your emitter and activate that. Radius per particle exists automatically. Radius pp is already built into n particles. You can go into the size, particle size. You can see I'll show you the per object you can control here, and you can randomize them maybe here. So now you can get probably a bit more precise result. Still a bit off, okay, but once they make them small enough and you put enough voxels in here, it's not a big deal, it's not a big problem, but it will happen forward as well, okay? So you can see that this particle is filling in all these voxels in here. So it's something to keep in mind. You can display your, for example, reduce view and take a look at the voxels, okay? So this particle is in between these two, so it's filling in weird, okay? The voxels around it. This will get solved once you start putting more resolution and reducing the particle size a little bit. So, like I said, it's not a big deal. It's not the end of the world. Just something to keep in mind, because I've seen simulations that you down raise them and then the density disappears. All right, cool. So we got that taken care of. We got particles being emitting fluid. I don't know what it will look like. We can play it and see what happens. Let's let it run a little. Maybe my turbulence is too high. You need to probably adjust a little bit. I wouldn't adjust the properties of the container. I will definitely do it on the emission. Okay, so if my turbulence is too high, maybe because I was using only one emitter before, and I did put a turbulence of 0.2 or something. Remember, that is per emitter, so that could be too much. I'm gonna put it to 0 for now. That's gonna help a little. So let's let this run. Next step is we're gonna also give these particles a different rate of emission, okay, to one another. Okay, so we have that. Okay, I won't even bother rendering this because I know it's gonna look like shit. So I'm gonna continue moving forward. Now let's go in and back into the particle emitter. Sorry, the fluid emitter on the particles. Let's go back in here. And we need to activate use per point rate. So you can, if you're trying to turn it on, it doesn't want to, you have to add it first. So you have to go into the particles and use per point emission rate. We did that on level 1. It's the same thing. So now you can see it's turned on, and now these particles will carry an attribute called on a per particle basis an attribute called fire emitter rate pp. So you can go in here and put an expression if you want it. It's just a multiplier on the numbers that you have on the emitter. So you could just say, copy this. It's just so each one is a little bit different. A random between, let's say, 0.5 and 1. It's just to give a little bit of change to those guys. Cool, so now it's turned on. Each one of these guys will have a little bit different rate of emission. It will show up once you start rendering. It will make obviously more sense, but at least the option is activated. So the radius is important, and this bit is important for sure in here. Now, I'm going to disable my fluid one more time, and I'm going to focus on the particles, the particle motion one more time. So let's turn that up, but at least the connection and the turning into emitters has been done. Now I'm going to go back in here and take a look at my particles and jump into my QuickTime. And let's find a frame that is, well, okay, so what's happening here, okay? You can see that I got tips that are quite thick, okay? But I do have resolution. So if I leave things as they are in my Maya scene right now, one particle is one emitter. So if I were to compare these two, it doesn't make any sense, right? So it seems here that I have emitters that are more localized. You can count them, 1 and 2, easy. Not this mess where it's filling the entire container. So how am I doing this? This is not made by one particle. It's impossible at this resolution because it means that my voxels are very small, okay? And I do get to get a big, I will have to have such a big particle to fill all those voxels that it will look terrible. This is actually a group of particles altogether. And if you start combining the different radiuses that they have, the different rate of emission that each one has, and just to manage to clump them together and turn a group of particles into an emitter, then you get a more natural result. Because it's subtle here, but you get more temperature in here than you get down there. If you get the right clump of particles together, right group, then you end up having interesting results. Okay, so keep an eye here. You can see, I don't know with the compression, but I'll upload this video. You can see the different groups, the different particles. But those particles seem to be aware of each other. Sometimes and I find it neat that they separate a little, and then they come back into the group. They reunite. Sometimes you can see they try to overtake each other. So here it's clear now that you can see what I'm doing. There is a particle here, a particle there, but they're still competing and interacting with one another. Okay, same thing here. You can see the variations in temperature, variations in shape, so quite useful as well. So the way I'm doing that is by taking advantage of the attraction and the attraction part of these particles. Go back to the force field generation thing. Okay. Well, no wind field. I need to do I'm going to close some of these tabs because it's too much. Okay. The force field generation. Okay. So I'm going to use. Okay. So this is already turned on. Okay. So the thickness relative usually is off. Okay. So turn it on to thickness. I don't know about the magnitude, but I'm going to make. I want these particles to attract themselves. So I'm going to increase that value to, for example, 10. The magnitude and the self-attract, they multiply each other. So you could set it to 1 and then up your magnitude. It's up to you either way. So I'm just going to, being a positive number means they're going to attract themselves. And then you need to give them a distance, like I said, to look for. So right now they're going to be looking for 2 units around them. So you can bring back your grid. So for example, this particle right here, okay, is going to use 2 units around it to look for neighbors. And if you find something, it's going to try to attract. And the same will happen to the one next to it, right? So this guy has a chance, 1, 2 units, so perfect. So this guy will find definitely this one, and this one will find the other one, and they will attract each other. And same thing in here. So 2 units could be okay. Just keep an eye on your scale of the scene using your grid and know if it's enough or not. If you go too big, I'll show you the result. But if you go, let's say you put a max distance of 10, okay, or a search distance of 10, means that each particle will look for particles around 10 units. So basically all the particles are going to find themselves, especially at the beginning where they're emitted. and they clump up all together into one ball. That's, in my case, not what I want. So if it's too small, then they don't see each other, and then there's no attraction. So you have to find the sweet spot. I think 2 units will do the trick for me. Let's rewind and play it. My idea is to have individual groups of particles. So I know that it's happening. It's hard to see it, but if you start to zoom in, you get this behavior here. That's what I want, but obviously amplified. Okay, so this is starting to happen. And the trick, or the trick that I'm using, okay, is that I don't want them to clump up only and stay as a clump. I want them to have a bit of a fight, internal turbulence of that group. Okay, meaning the particles will try to let go and then be pulled back in, because that will translate into interesting. That's what I was trying to say. That sometimes the particles try to overtake each other. They try to separate a little bit, but they come back into the group. It's a very subtle thing, but it will definitely give you a more realistic result, especially when you deal with motion blur and things like that. And how do I achieve that is by keeping the self-collision turned on. So I'm going to go back in here, and self-collide is turned on. So right now these particles are pulled in together. They have to collide with one another, and based on that, you know, the strength of the collision, which is actually right here, collision strength. If you up this number, when they bounce with more energy. So they will try to separate each other and pull back in, and that's what keeps them moving and active. Part of the group, but moving around. If you turn off self-collide, these guys will clump up into dots almost. So it's not that interesting as they move along. It will be, well, I'm going to amplify things a little bit now, but self-collide is important. And not only self-collide, I don't want them to self-collide fully. So I'm going to rewind and play this back one more time. What I mean by self-collide fully, I mean by using a collision width of 1. Because as you saw, the collisions happen right on the edge of each particle. And I don't really want that. I want them to overlap. I want them to go inside of one another, but then at some point start to repel themselves and so on. So I'm going to take my collision, my self-collision width scale, and I'm going to reduce that to a value of 0.5 probably. So that will allow them to overlap a little, okay, unify and become a bigger group. And as you know, that will give me a result like this. This is a collection of particles, and then at some point they're going to start to separate. Due to that collision, and you know, do what they need to do. I'm going to probably up my collide strength to 1.5. That's the collide. I'm sorry, there is a self collide. No, that's fine. That's the one. You can give them a bit more bounce if needed, and I could make them, just for fun, a bit sticky. Okay, it's subtleties. Okay, just picture them in your mind. Spend some time at home and play with the particles, and you'll see what they do. I can kind of visualize in my head what happens with these things, but play a little bit with that. So a little bit of stickiness, a bit of overlap, and a lot of collision strength, plus the self-attraction, it becomes a turbulent clump. Okay, so I'm going to go in and fix a couple of my values in here for the self-attraction. I'm going to up my magnitude, and I will probably have to up my self-collision distance, my point field distance, I'm sorry. Let's see what I get. Okay, so they are definitely attracting, but they're having a hard time finding each other. So I'm going to increase my distance a little bit. And I'm going to do that slowly. Okay, so I'm getting more groups. Okay, so less individual bits. And that's what you want to do. You want to try to get rid of these guys on their own there. Go a bit higher. So let's double it one more time. Okay, this could be a bit too much, but it could work. I mean, it could be fine. You can see now they get more defined, and all this blabbering that I had about the interaction and all, you can probably see it now. It looks like a raspberry. So this it's not really moving as much as I wanted to separating each other that much. I'm going to increase a little bit more my collision strength. But you know, this is kind of the rough idea. If you spend enough time, we're running out of time on the class, but if you spend enough time fiddling with these numbers, then you will end up with exactly what you want. Okay. So I think this is fine with me. You can very clearly see how the attraction works. They start pulling in particles around. Probably it will be a good idea to pull the emitter back a little, give them more time to group before they. That's going to mean that I have to give them a little bit more life, or I can push them a little bit faster, because they're going to die inside. If they die inside the container, then the fire extinguishes itself right away. So that's not good. So I'm going to push them a little bit faster. So give them time to group. When they enter the box, they're closer to clumps than the individual bits. Okay, so that seems to be working fine. That means I can push this a little bit further back. It's all about the way they look when they enter the box. So you could even do this kind of thing. Don't worry about what happens on emission so you don't get distracted. And keep an eye when they enter the fluid, they're entering as groups. There's still a few random ones, but it's okay. I mean, you can clear them by spending more time on this. But that's good. Perfect. So I'm happy with that. Let's see what that looks then when the fluid is turned on. I'm going to save this thing. I have a bad feeling. All right. Cool. So turn the fluid on and turn its display on. The resolution is low, okay, but I'm going to run it. See what that does. Start typing the questions for the end of the class, okay? So anything that they want to discuss, make sure to type it there. I think the amount of velocity that I'm emitting is a bit high, because you can see it gets very, very turbulent right away. So probably take a look at that in a minute. Let's see what this looks rendered. It won't look pretty, but let's see. I will have to reduce the particle size, but it's very simple to do. You know, just go in and yeah. So there's a lot of stuff going on in here. So let's do one while I answer your questions. Let's run one simulation with more resolution. So let's go in and do a 3-to-1 ratio. I'm going to reduce the particle size a little. Particle radius to half. Okay. And the amount of emission that they're doing, I'm going to lower that a little bit too, a bit too much. So I'm going to do probably, let's do half of what I have. Because now that, you know, I was treating them as individual emitters. Once they group together, then you have all these particles emitting so much that it could get too heavy. There's no turbulence in here, and I'm going to inherit a bit less. Let's inherit 100%. And that will be good. Actually, I'm going to put a little bit more resolution, hoping that you guys have questions for me. So I'm going to put that to 400. And so it runs faster, remember. It's starting to get slow. If it runs faster by just turning the display off. I'm going to save the scene again, and I'm going to hit play, let it run, and let's see what you guys... Another thing was, before I jump back into the classroom, is that you could cache the particles, the end particles, okay? Just do an end cache of it. That way you don't have to simulate that bit. It will speed up a little bit, the simulation. Not too much, but it will give you a bit of a speed increase. So I'm going to let that run. Let me just see how fast this thing is going to move. With 400, it's moving a bit on the slow side. I don't know if I'm going to have enough time to... I'm going to go back to 300. Just for speed's sake. Okay, so... Well, just to be on the safe side, let's run it at 200, 2-to-1. You get the idea of what it does on full resolution. Okay, so let me jump back in here. What about emitting a few particles and through them emit another set of particles and go to them? Yes, that's fine. You remember from level 1, Ellie, you were with me on level 1 before, when we did the trails, like when we were actually on the goals class, okay? We were having a few particles, like 4 or 5 particles jumping around. Then we were emitting from those particles another set and golding them together, and then emitting another set after that. And that gave us this very interesting trails of exactly. So if you picture that in your head, you could use that technique and emit the fire out of the final set of particles. There's no gold to anything, and you will end up with very beautiful trails of fire in this case, or whatever you want, smoke or. So yeah, that's why I was saying earlier, I like to live this until the end, towards the end of level 2 at least, excuse me, because these things happen. You know, you've seen so many hours of training with particles that then I'm sure you can do a million things. Gold them to surface and have the particles flow along a surface and then emit fluid from it, for example. That is another way. Yeah, any way you like. Perfect. So any questions, guys? The rest of you? I will post the video on the community for reference. I think ideally, okay, if you guys have the time, you wouldn't do a straight line like I have. You will do something more airbender-like. So let me open this. What you guys send me? Thank you. Who was? Victor. Okay, yeah, well the first fire trail is interesting. This guy who wants some rock, if I'm mistaken. And then there's some fire down. There we go. Try to do something like that last bit, you know. You can see the fire comes from that source. It's perfect. It comes from the source and it's very easy to do. And then you have your particles flow along. In this case, if you wanted to do a trail that stays perfectly long all the time, make sure your particles, instead of being clumped as like raspberries, as I have, kind of thing, give them a bit of a longer trail. Doesn't have to be the trail of particles, doesn't have to be as long as the trail of fire. You know that because the fire has time to dissipate, so it will still maintain its shape. But it will have to be probably a little bit longer than mine. You can see mine, my trails tend to widen at the back, and that's just because the fluid dynamics of the fire take over. But you know, you can see here it's a bit more compressed. If I were to make my emitter a bit longer, okay, instead of being it's a spherical shape, if it's more of a cylindrical bit, you can achieve that as well. But then this is now that we went through this, it's very easy. I'm sure that it's very easy to picture what the particles need to do. And the fire is for free, I will say, pretty much. If you already did the example from last week, the rest is done. You know? And in this case, you could make it collide with a piece of geometry. Okay, so here it goes, and then this piece of ground comes up, and then the particles collide with it. I wouldn't collide the fluid with the geometry. I will try to collide the particles and have the particles splash a little bit or something, and it will look better probably than colliding the fluid itself. You could do the fluid collision, give it a try, but I think the result will be better with the particles. But yeah, perfect. So Dave, you have no questions. I don't hear from Keith. Are you guys there? Are you guys in the class with us? You know, I like to get a little bit of feedback if you don't mind. Just a yes or a no is more than enough for me. Sometimes I feel like you guys are not there. Victor, you good? How about you, Darius? Are you okay? Daryl and Darius, I have the 2D guys. Are you guys okay? Everything clear? Okay, well that's good. Glad to hear that you're there. All right, cool. So let's go back and take a look and see what this looks like. I almost forgot to check what I was simming. There we go. So I'm gonna pause it. Okay, let's see where we are. This 64 frames. That's good. Let's see what this looks. I'm not know if it's gonna be perfect or not, but okay. So, they barely entered the domain, but that's fine. We can render this frame and see what that looks like. Well, hard to say, but you can see. I'm gonna zoom in a little bit more and render one more time. You can see clearly what's going to happen. The particles, the end particles by themselves, they render, okay, by the way. They're renderable with any engine, so you have to turn them off, their display. Well, it's going to look cool once I have enough time to to run them. Maybe I have too many individual particles. I'll have to adjust it a little bit. But it does work. You see, by changing the resolution, it's more localized, the whole thing. All right, perfect. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. And those of you watching the recording, thank you, and I'll see you next week.